The Vietnam War was one of the most intense and controversial conflicts of the 20th century. It lasted from 1955 to 1975 and took place in Vietnam, a small Southeast Asian country. On one side was North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, fighting to unite the country under communism. On the other side was South Vietnam, supported mainly by the United States, which wanted to stop the spread of communism in Asia. More than just a local fight, the Vietnam War became part of the larger Cold War struggle between the US and the Soviet Union. Over the years, it involved millions of soldiers and civilians, devastating both Vietnam and American morale. The war ended with the fall of Saigon in 1975 and a complete US withdrawal. Even today, the Vietnam War leaves behind powerful lessons about politics, military strategy, and the cost of foreign intervention. The Vietnam War was a 20-year-long conflict that turned a small Southeast Asian country into a major battlefield of the Cold War. It began in 1955 when North Vietnam, a communist state led by Ho Chi Minh, tried to unify the country by overthrowing the US-backed South Vietnamese government. What started as a civil war quickly pulled in foreign powers. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, sent military advisors, then ground troops, and finally launched full-scale bombing campaigns. On the other side, the Soviet Union and China supported North Vietnam with weapons and training. It wasn't just a war of soldiers. It became a war of ideas, of politics, and public opinion. Over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese died. And when the US finally withdrew in 1973, South Vietnam soon fell. The Vietnam War reshaped American foreign policy and changed how future wars would be fought. To understand the Vietnam War, we need to look at what happened right after World War II. Vietnam had been under French colonial rule for decades, but in 1945, a group called the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, declared independence. Ho admired American ideals and even quoted the US Declaration of Independence. But the West wasn't ready to let go of colonial control. France tried to reclaim Vietnam, and by 1946, a new conflict began, the First Indochina War. The Viet Minh, using guerrilla tactics, fought hard for independence. In 1954, they achieved a major victory at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which shocked the world and forced France to surrender. Soon after, world powers met in Geneva to figure out what to do. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel, with North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh and South Vietnam backed by the West. Elections were promised in 1956 to unify the country, but they never happened. The US feared that Ho Chi Minh, a communist, would win. This set the stage for growing tension between North and South and slowly dragged America into a conflict that would last 2 decades. After the Geneva Accords, South Vietnam was ruled by Ngo Dinh Diem, a strong anti-communist leader. The US saw Diem as a key player in stopping communism from spreading across Asia. Even though his government was corrupt and unpopular, the US sent money, weapons, and military advisors to keep him in power. But Diem's rule made things worse. He refused to hold elections and cracked down on Buddhists and anyone who opposed him. In the countryside, a new enemy appeared, the Viet Cong, South Vietnamese communist fighters supported by the North. They used guerrilla tactics to attack villages and government forces. In 1963, Diem was overthrown and killed in a military coup. The South was left in political chaos. Then came a turning point, the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. The US claimed that North Vietnamese boats attacked American ships. Congress responded with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson full power to use military force in Vietnam without officially declaring war. This was the beginning of full-scale US involvement. What had started as a small advisory mission quickly turned into a massive military operation. In 1965, America was fully committed. President Johnson ordered the first combat troops into Vietnam and launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The goal was to break the North's will and cut off support for the Viet Cong in the South. But the North Vietnamese, under General Von Nguyen Giap, were determined. They used guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run tactics, and made full use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a jungle supply network running through Laos and Cambodia. The US had superior firepower and technology, but they were fighting an enemy that was invisible, fast, and familiar with the terrain. American troop numbers exploded, from around 23,000 in 1964 to over 500,000 by 1968. Battles like Ia Drang Valley in 1965, the first major crash between US and North Vietnamese forces, showed how deadly the war would become. Meanwhile, at home, public opinion started to shift. Graphic news footage of bombings and body bags stirred doubt and anger. Many began to question why the US was fighting a war so far away. Then came the shock. The Tet Offensive in January 1968. Thousands of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops launched surprise attacks across South Vietnam, even hitting the US Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, it was a failure for the Communists, but it crushed American morale. People realized the war was far from over, despite government claims of progress. This was a turning point. The war would only grow more controversial from here on out. The Tet Offensive, launched in January 1968, marked a major turning point in the Vietnam War. Named after the Vietnamese New Year holiday, Tet, this surprise attack saw more than 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops launch coordinated strikes on over 100 cities and military targets across South Vietnam, including Saigon, the capital. Although the offensive was eventually repelled and considered a military failure for the Communists, it had a huge psychological effect. Americans had been told the US was winning the war, but now it was clear that the enemy was still strong, organized, and capable of massive attacks, even in supposedly safe areas. One of the most shocking moments was the brief assault on the US Embassy in Saigon. Even though it was defended successfully, images of the embassy under siege shattered the illusion of American control. Back in the United States, public opinion shifted dramatically. Support for the war plummeted. Anti-war protests grew louder, especially among students, civil rights activists, and veterans. Trust in the government began to erode. President Lyndon B. Johnson, facing growing criticism, chose not to run for re-election in 1968. His announcement stunned the nation. It showed just how deeply the war had divided the country and how uncertain the future had become. In the meantime, Richard Nixon won the presidency on a promise of restoring order and ending the war with honor. But ending the war would prove far more complicated than anyone expected. When President Nixon took office in 1969, he introduced a new plan called Vietnamization. The idea was to slowly withdraw American troops while training and equipping the South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, to take over the fight. Nixon wanted to reduce US involvement but still avoid defeat. At the same time, he secretly expanded the war. Without telling the public, the US began bombing Cambodia and Laos, targeting parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail used by North Vietnamese forces. These secret wars aimed to cut enemy supply lines, but they also destabilized neighboring countries and led to civilian deaths, sparking more outrage back home. Despite these efforts, the ARVN often struggled in battle. Corruption, poor leadership, and low morale made it difficult for South Vietnam to stand on its own. Meanwhile, peace talks dragged on in Paris, with both sides unwilling to make major compromises. In 1970, Nixon ordered a controversial invasion of Cambodia, reigniting protests across the US. The most tragic moment came at the Kent State University. where National Guardsmen shot and killed 4 students during an anti-war protest. By 1973, after intense negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. U.S. combat troops were officially withdrawn, but the fighting in Vietnam was far from over. In January 1973, after years of drawn-out negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all U.S. troops, and return of prisoners of war, and the promise of peaceful reconciliation between North and South Vietnam. For the United States, this marked the official end of direct military involvement. President Nixon presented it as peace with honor, but few believed the conflict was truly resolved. Even as American troops departed, the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, remained in parts of the South, and both sides quietly prepared for more fighting. Though U.S. forces were gone, the U.S. continued to send financial and military aid to South Vietnam. But without American troops on the ground, the South Vietnamese were left to face a powerful enemy alone. The war entered its final and most decisive phase. By 1975, the South Vietnamese government was crumbling. The North Vietnamese Army, stronger and better organized, launched a full-scale offensive in March. City after city fell with little resistance. The ARVN, overwhelmed and under-equipped, could not stop the advance. On April 30th, 1975, Saigon fell. North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the capital as helicopters scrambled to evacuate remaining Americans and South Vietnamese allies from the U.S. Embassy rooftop. The images of that chaotic final day, panicked crowds, overloaded helicopters, and desperate families became lasting symbols of the war's end. The war was over. Vietnam was reunified under communist rule, becoming the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. For America, it marked a painful end to a long and controversial war. Millions had died, including over 58,000 Americans, and both Vietnamese civilians and soldiers suffered on an enormous scale. The aftermath of the Vietnam War was devastating. The country faced massive destruction, economic hardships, and the challenges of rebuilding under a new regime. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese were sent to re-education camps, and many fled the country as refugees, becoming known as boat people. In the United States, the war shattered public trust in the government and military. The use of conscription, controversial tactics like napalm and Agent Orange, and the lack of a clear victory led to decades of reflection and debate. The U.S. military reevaluated its strategies, leading to what's now called the Vietnam Syndrome, national reluctance to enter foreign conflicts. Vietnam also became a key moment in the history of protest movements, the media's role in war, and the limits of superpower influence. This was our deep dive into the Vietnam War. If you found this video informative, please give it a like, share it, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into important moments from world history. Thanks for watching.